From someone else's childhood back to mine, growing up with both a Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 meant I was in the depth of the second mascot platformer boom, and while not my favorite era for the genre, third is where my heart lies what with Sly and Ratchet Games' regular rentals, I do have a soft spot for some of the homies in the second generation, specifically two reptiles. Gex, whose games I have to play again since it's been a long time since I've hung out with the wisecracking lounge lizard, and the subject for today's video. The original lineup for the Spyro series was the first ever trilogy of games I owned, and while I never got too far in them as a wee laddie, I have gone back to finish them in my adulthood? Current iteration? Yeah, let's go with that. That was around when I first discovered emulation, and I can thank Spyro 1 for getting me into this wacky world of the YouTube content creation business. ? Basically, I owe Spyro a lot of credit, so I might as well give it to him. It's so strange to think that this title was the second in Insomniac Games' storied history. Strap yourselves in as we are covering one of the bigger boys in games development. So to begin anywhere, let's start at, well, the beginning. 1977 to be exact. The year of Star Wars, Suspiria, and the Atari 2600. All three cultural icons in either genre, sci-fi for Star Wars, giallo for Suspiria, history, or both. While you can pull hairs over the definition of the birth of video games and consoles, it is assumedly safe to propose the Atari 2600 as the first major video game console compared to the Magnavox Odyssey, the numerous amount of Pong-only machines, or those home versions of vector-graphic arcade cabinets. The Wild West days that are messier than losing a game of poker with a dead man's hand. Remember, Nintendo did have a go at making Pong machines, but that is a story for another time, and possibly another channel entirely. One figure I haven't brought up, though, is Ted Price. While a child at the time, he would have future plans after dickering around with his Atari. Man says it best in an interview with Game Informer. I did a speech at PAX where I was talking about how I got started as a creator and how my parents encouraged me to create from whatever was around. And then when I was 9, we had an Atari 2600. We got one for Christmas. At that point, I wanted to make games, but I had no understanding of what it took. If I was a musically inclined mesh of sinews and fibrous tissue, I would hum the following tune. A tale as old as time. But I'm not, so I won't. Like many impressionable kids that pick up a controller, they immediately want to be designing their own titles and creations. That's a story I can relate to, and look where it got me. As I am now reminded of the forlorn sadness of my deeper vestibules, Ted's fascination with the burgeoning industry would become realized when he got older. As he tells G4TV, I remember asking my dad to buy an Apple IIe. Back when they had the monochrome monitors, I said, "Dad, if you buy me this, I'm gonna make a video game and make $1 million, and I was 10 at the time. Fast forward, Ted worked for his uncle under the medical profession where he realized, man, this sucks, creatively speaking. Bookkeeping and all that office busy work wasn't sparking any amount of joy in his life, so he decided to pull the trigger and chase after his passion for video games post his graduation from Princeton University. Between the years 1993 and early 1994, Ted moves to California, files and gets approved by the Secretary of State for Incorporation, the business name, Extreme Software. It was the 90s, brah. A name that Ted Price has gone on to say was a mistake because another company had already filed under that name, leading to Insomniac Games being chosen as the name for the developer. All he had was the clothes on his back, whatever change in his pocket, and a dream. As Ted recounts to Venture Beat, it's been rare that I tell the story about it, but I'm happy to share some of the early days. February of 1994, tomorrow actually, 25 years ago, is when we received the approved articles of incorporation from the California Secretary of State. That marks the official beginning of Insomniac. Back then I had filed the articles under Extreme Software. We ultimately changed the name, but in February it was me in a 10x10 office with a 3DO dev station that I'd spent a lot of my savings on. I had grand hopes and dreams, but very little clue about what it took to make games. Yeah, the 3DO. The pre-PS triple punchline that Trip Hawkins thought up in a fever dream and made real. The timeline does fit, though. The 3DO was just released back on October 4th, 1993. It positioned itself as the strongest console hardware-wise at the time, and it was backed by EA's founder, the aforementioned Trip Hawkins, and some strong marketing. Say it with me now, too big to fail. And as we all know, it crashed and burned harder than Activision Blizzard's attempt at selling Diablo fans Immortal. No, it wasn't an out-of-season April Fool's joke. For a legitimate answer, the reason for why Ted went with a 3DO was because dev kits were cheaper. Back to the pressing matters, Ted was slaving away by his lonesome in his office, his core directive to make an FPS like Doom. Telling Game Informer, Ted recounts that, when I started Insomniac, my goal was to make a console game, and more specifically something that was a lot like Doom, because I was playing a hell of a lot of Doom and was so enamored with that game. Who wouldn't be? It revolutionized the industry in more ways than just sales numbers or graphics. While I may posit that Silent Hill 2 will always be the most important game in the industry, I know I'm in the minority when you stack it up to Doom. 3D was starting to become more the norm, and one of the best ways to get in on the action, as around this time, development was a loose confederacy where even the experts were unsure of what they were doing, was to create a Doom clone. The holy trinity, as Civi puts it, of build engine games were wrought from the wakes of Doom's multitude of releases, and ever such early 3D FPS titles like Ultima Underworld and Wolfenstein, or if you want to go way further back, 3D Monster Maze and Dungeons of Daggeroth. So like the holy trinity of presenters on Top Gear, Ted asked himself, how hard can it be? Turns out, quite. But fate provides a funny wrinkle to this story. Back at Princeton, though a few years separated from Ted, was a man by the name of Al Hastings. By 1994, he was a senior at the college and looking for a job. What played out was a game of phone tag, as Ted puts it in the G4 interview, or for a simplified version, here's a quote from him in the Venture Beat interview. I struggled for a while, and I got very lucky in meeting a guy named Al Hastings, who was in his senior year at Princeton, which was also my alma mater. We never run into each other because we were a few years apart, but I called him thanks to an introduction from a friend, and he agreed to come out and join this nascent company as soon as he graduated. What was fantastic about that May-June period when he came out in 1994 was, we dove in and made a demo for a game, our first game, Disruptor. To give an idea on the tech wizardry of Al, he coded an FPS engine in a month, allowing the duo to shop around California for a publisher. Yet, as time went on and cash started running low, no one was biting. Presumably because the writing was on the wall for the 3DO. The astronomical price tag for the console plus the over-reliance of FMV titles made it without a target market. Compare it to the hot new PlayStation 1, which was right around the corner, or even Sony's whipping boy, the Sega Saturn. Both consoles set out what the 3DO wanted to do, not only with a cheaper consumer cost, but better game libraries. However, one man and publisher took interest in Ted and Al's work. Mark Cerny and the publisher he was with at the time, Universal. There's a few recountings of the story where some bits are omitted, so I'll give you two quotes. From Venture Beat, Ted gives this when it came to meeting Universal and Cerny. It was about a month later that we were down to my last $1,000, which had to pay for the rent on my apartment, the rent on our office, our food, everything. I was thinking that this was going to fail before it even started. But again, another friend called and said, you should talk to the people at Universal. They've just started an interactive division. We jumped in the car one more time, drove up from San Diego to Los Angeles, and presented the tape to Mark Cerny, who had been brought on as the executive producer at this new publisher. When Ted and Al got back to their office, a message from Cerny was left on their answering machine saying that a deal was on. IGN's always independent, the story of Insomniac Games goes with this. At the time of Disruptor, Cerny was the executive producer of Universal Interactive Studios. In fact, when Price and Hastings were shopping their Doom clone to various publishers, Cerny was the one who saw the potential not only in their game, but in their studio. Universal was the last place that we visited. It was kind of our last shot, Price said. Ironically, or interestingly, I believe we were there the same day that the Naughty Dog guys were showing off Way of the Warrior. Cerny picked up Disruptor on behalf of Universal, and his exceptionally important relationship with Insomniac was set. Mark is a really hands-on guy, Price continued later. He gave us a lot of fantastic advice on production and how it works. He also did a lot of the level designs for our early games. Just jumped in, was actually doing maps. I feel like he is a mentor. He's been a mentor for me in terms of teaching me what good game design is. Either way, Universal told Ted now that because the 3DO's future was assured like a sinking ship, it would be better for them to convert Disruptor over to a PlayStation 1 engine. Ted thought that was impossible. 2 weeks later, Al banged it out, no sweat. Around this time was when Insomniac was properly formed. I've already brought up the name change earlier due to someone else filing the name Extreme Software before Ted, but the reason for why the name Insomniac was chosen was because the lads were working day in and day out. Added to the team was Al's brother Brian, and the three got to work on Disruptor, the game seen a '96 release. One quote, if I may: "The best game that nobody's ever heard of." Despite reviewing somewhat well, Disruptor's sales were abysmal, categorizing it as a commercial failure. To put this into perspective, John Romero, the wilder of the two Doom Johns, was impressed with the project when he saw it at GDC during an Insomniac hiring showcase. Out of the whole Insomniac library, it is one of their most forgotten games despite its importance to the company. Back to the IGN article, we're provided with this. And the legacy of the game internally at Insomniac is mixed, looked at more as a teaching tool than anything else. I think for us, it was our training wheels, Price said, reflecting on his first game. We're fortunate to have a game like Disruptor where we learned a lot of hard lessons about production early. We learned about good level design from guys like Mark Cerny and Michael John. We learned a lot more about what turns us on as developers. This left Insomniac in the lurch. A sequel to Disruptor would go over like a lead balloon, as even if the critics liked it, money makes the world go round. With only 5 members making up Insomniac at the time, morale was down and the ship was adrift. In steps Mark Cerny again with a quick observation that I'll paraphrase, as the Game Informer video doesn't have a transcript, making writing word-for-word quotes a bit of a hassle. "Oi! That Mario fella's pretty popular on the Nintendo 64, and the PlayStation doesn't have a mascot like him to sell to a general audience." As if Nostradamus possessed him, Craig Stitt, one of the artists for Insomniac, was already spitballing an idea for a game centered around a dragon. Al, in his downtime, was writing a new engine capable of displaying fully 3D worlds while keeping memory issues in mind. These 3 ideas coalesced, fueled by the lads at Insomniac constantly playing Mario 64, birthing the conditions for Spyro the Dragon. I can't do justice to the wonders of Al Hastings' coding abilities. I've linked below the making of Spyro the Dragon from PlayStation Underground, as both he and Cerny go into the depths of the engine the former wrote. This is groundbreaking coding that would end up shaping a lot of game design to come. All because Al wanted to have a fully 3D world without noticeable fog or a draw distance. Funnily enough, Peter Hastings, the third of the brothers Hastings, and Ted were also formulating other ideas into future projects to put on the back burner. The CEO wanting to create a game about an alien invasion of Earth. A little resistance, maybe? Something about the fall of man. But back to our dragon, there was an issue regarding the character's name. From a Games TM interview, the following was revealed. Spyro was originally named Pete, Hastings reveals, but it didn't take long for our publisher's lawyers to tell us that Disney had a movie called Pete's Dragon, and there was no way that was going to fly. The name Pyro the Dragon was briefly considered, but sounded a little too mature, so we settled on Spyro. Another pitfall the team wanted to avoid was the somewhat boring level rotation of Grassy Field, Fiery Hell Zone, and Winter Wonderland. They had a lot of other platformers, Mario included, indulge in. Thus, led by artist Christine von Chevron, the world of Spyro would be a fully realized place with varying races of dragons and creatures with worlds to match. Of the most interesting parts of Spyro's development was the nature of the dragon. Paraphrased from Ted within the PlayStation Underground video, dragons are capable of breathing fire, running, jumping, almost anything. That includes flying and gliding, which not a lot of other mascots had as their main ability. If you can recall, the glide hat in Mario 64 is mostly a puzzle-solving item, not a basic ability. However, if gliding was going to be a major part of the dragon's exploratory capabilities, it had to be finely tuned. Back to Games TM, but for large terrain traversal, Spyro's control system needed to be accurate and fluid. Insomniac did a bang-up job, with Spyro boasting some of the smoothest controls among platformers at the time. And like other developmental decisions, the explanation behind this achievement is unorthodox. We hired a rocket scientist from NASA, Hastings says. No, really, Matt Whiting programmed a great deal of the control and camera code, and the smoothness of the controls is owed to his ability to squeeze a great deal of matrix algebra into the tiny slice of computational time that the PlayStation could give us. Even Matt was impressed with what Insomniac had staged out, his touches rounding out the game's controls. Probably one of the better known aspects of Spyro's development is its sound direction. Famed drummer Stuart Copeland of the British new wave rock band The Police was in the composer role. Copeland by this time in his career was a free agent. The Police disbanded for the time, and Copeland was pursuing his own goals and being a family man. This led to a number of producers for TV shows, movies, and even operas to commission him for tracks. That's how Insomniac got him on board. A little part of me also wants to believe that one of Copeland's sons, Patrick, nudged him into taking it, as he's in fact a gamer. Describing his time as composer for Spyro, Copeland had this to say to Games TM. I had the game in front of me and it was glorious. It took me a while to get through the levels because I was so crap at it, so because I could play it, I'd have the music I created on a loop while I played the levels. But sometimes I'd find myself forgetting about the music entirely while trying to finish the level. It was an early version of the game, so it had glitches, of course. I could fly right out of the world and off into space, come around and view the level from behind. It ended up looking like a movie set. I also had cheats to help me through the game, such as invincibility, which was critical to actually helping me experience the game. By the way, all the careful work I did in matching certain tracks to particular levels went unused. I'm not sure if they were just unaware that I matched levels with tracks, or they just made different creative choices, but the results seemed kind of random to me. Despite a tight deadline, Copeland worked a stormer, producing around 3 to 4 tracks a day with some time for touching up. He's gone on record by saying that the production of the first 3 Spyro titles were, as he puts it, some of the best tunes I ever wrote. Seeing a circuit at E3 in '98 and a September and October release on the PlayStation 1 in the same year, Spyro's slightly slower initial sales were immediately offset by the holiday season and the promotion SCE's American marketing vice president Andrew House did to get general audiences to buy into the PlayStation. It left a lasting legacy that can still be felt today and was what put Insomniac Games on the map. It would later be re-released a number of times and see a remake as part of the Reignited trilogy developed by Toys for Bob in collaboration with Insomniac and published by Activision. But I'm not looking at that version. I instead booted up an emulator to play the original copy of Spyro the Dragon. There isn't really much to say about Spyro the Dragon's story since it's so cut and dry, but, you know, there are some funny observations you can make within the plot of Spyro the Dragon, particularly how the dragons represent a more naturalistic ideology, while Gnasty Gnorc and his minions are far more technologically advanced, seeing as their homeworld has battleships and modern military rifles. They are far down the line of autocracy, with the main Gnorc forces armed with a smorgasbord of weapons all across a civilization tech tree. That's not even counting the numerous creatures that have aligned with Gnasty, as while the Gnorcs are the most prevalent race within his army, he's pulling a page from the Covenant's book, what with the multitude of wizards, trained animals, and other such nominal races flying under his banner. Compare that to the dragons, who are both quite insular and rather discriminatory. Gnasty didn't throw the first stone, as he was simply minding his own business before rude remarks were thrown his way. The fact that the dragons thought they could engage in a bit of mudslinging and think themselves above the repercussions showcases their arrogance. Why should Gnasty be exiled from society and viewed as a pariah when the dragons are clearly the villains? He was merely rising above an oppressive hierarchy and paying the dragons' greed forward by converting their precious gems into his own army. And that's why I said funny. All these remarks are complete bull hockey. Story analysis has to walk a fine line between acknowledging the whole of the source material and personal interpretation. It's what makes viewing the story of Spyro under the lens I jokingly presented difficult to take seriously. The leaps and bounds of logic are exactly that. Why make the mistake of thinking hoofbeats for zebras? Especially since context provides the horses with water. It's what makes covering media a minefield to walk through, as there will always be a subset of people that latch onto a viewpoint that is so utterly insane or trite beyond reason, and this is regardless of what is actually being covered. Headcanon's grape shot rips through any and all ships, but that doesn't mean all are torn apart the same way or even damaged in the blast. The point I'm trying to make is this. Headcanons have a purpose in the discussion and analysis of stories. This is how we understand media as a whole, as interpretation directly spurs inquiry and examination of both the text and how others view it. Yet this is where context and framing also take shape. The very structure of the story is key in determining a meaning. Deaf the author, or whatever form it has been so turgidly corrupted into, is woefully ignorant as it posits its ideas of infinite meaninglessness. If the reader is the be-all, end-all, then any conclusion is equal in spite of how it was reached or what it may imply. That would mean my ridiculous postulation, bordering on near parody levels of snobbish dissertation, would be in fact truthful. I guess Spyro's really about the divide between a smug naturalistic ruling class and a technologically advanced if foolhardy undergroup. Or what's definitely more likely and less sounding like a street corner end is nigh rant, Spyro needs to stop Gnasty Gnorc because he's evil like a Saturday morning cartoon villain and turned all the other dragons into crystals. Charm and charming are the two apt words I would use when describing Spyro the Dragon's presentation. There's just something about PlayStation 1 era graphics backed by a colorful and imaginative art direction. Yes, the models sometimes clip through themselves and the backdrops of the levels are a simple skybox, but much like Anton Ego enjoying his morsel of ratatouille, it brings me back to a defining moment of my life when I first picked up a controller. And that is merely the surface level observation of how the game looks. The PlayStation 1 had graphical limitations due to the weaker memory of the console, that's why the Dreamcast had superior ports of fighting games, yet Insomniac worked around these key problems of it.
Welcome to Wizard Peaks. This is my favorite supercharged spot. Use it to bash those wizards.
The slight pop-in is a consultation of having a pretty far draw distance, and the only pieces of the geometry that do this are non-essential. No enemy or item ever sneaks up on you except for when the developers are laying a trap like the bored Beastmakers that waits for you around the corner of the house. That's pretty impressive, especially in comparison to other games of the era like Gex Enter the Gecko, which had a pretty noticeable fog of war, or Crash, which didn't venture into making fully 3D worlds and stuck with the course format. This is hitting closer to Super Mario 64, the basis for Spyro's design as mentioned in history, which isn't exactly a fair comparison for Insomniac, as Spyro was a third-party production compared to Mario 64, which was an in-house Nintendo project meant to signal the release of the Nintendo 64. For a second game under their belt, Insomniac was already aiming and shooting big despite budget and size limitations. They were implementing ideas from a much larger production size and scale-wise, yet pulling it off like it was nothing. Shuffling back to the draw distance, one of the best design ideas for the title is completely tied to it: the twinkle of the gems. You don't have to physically see a gem to know where it is, because while the model might unload when it reaches past the draw distance, the twinkle does not. This acts as signposting, informing the player where they have and haven't been, as if you can see that twinkle, that means you haven't been over to where it is. And in those instances of searching for the last bit of treasure within a stage, that little shimmer is a godsend. While I've mentioned that items unload when out of the draw distance, Spyro takes advantage of lower resolution models to still keep game entities within a player's sight when whatever it is, be it a chest or an enemy, hasn't breached that threshold.
When you free a dragon or step on one of their platforms, you're saving your progress. That could be useful if you run into trouble. Not that you ever run into trouble, Spyro.
After you've freed all the dragons, pass through this fancy vortex thingamajigger. It'll take you back to the artisan home. But first, let me tell you a story.
No thanks. See ya.
This is absolutely helpful and cuts down on a lot of backtracking or warns the player what is coming up next. I can mentally prepare myself when I see that Misty Bog has thrown about 4 dragon-eating plants my way because I can spot their faraway models. All of these techniques are still used today in a lot of open world titles or games with larger levels. Elden Ring lowers enemy animation frames when they are far out as a memory saving technique, for instance. While I don't know if Spyro is a forefather when it came to many developmental methods going forward from its release, there is a nice time lapse from here to now that can be seen. But a game's presentation is more than its inner workings, as Spyro is still one of the more inspired mascot platformers I've played, to which I think the art direction as it carries the heaviest load. One aspect I particularly enjoy in video games is level cohesion. While the later Spyro games would drop this element for more fantastical worlds and sparse connections, which isn't a negative, Spyro 2 and 3 have gorgeous levels, I love how there was key importance in crafting the Home of the Dragons. There is a concurrent theme with a level hub in its courses that can be immediately seen. The Peacekeeper stages are all cliffsides and deserts. Places that, while not completely inhospitable, take a hardy person to survive and thrive in. The Peacekeepers themselves are the militaristic branch of the dragons, informing us that they were probably shaped by their environment to be the way that they are. Likewise, and most definitely done mockingly, the Gnorcs guarding the Peacekeeper hub are all traditional Napoleonic troops and dragoons, a type of peacekeeper, so to speak. Contrast that with the Magic Crafter and Dreamweaver dragons, who bear a more sagely appearance to fit with their magically inclined role. Both families look similar to the other, so you can theorize that they probably work closely together compared to the other dragon types. Their stages are also more mystical and eccentric compared to the down-to-earth artisans or peacekeepers. The only fault here is that the Beastmakers don't visually represent their world well, even though their stages have a hearty blend of natural landscapes with technology encroaching in. Even Ganasti's characters visualize in the stages, as the harbor theme brings to mind warships that goes along with the Gnorc's militaristic attitude. Not even stopping there, enemies are coded to their stages, then playing to the world themes harder than the dragons. From the aforementioned Gnorc troops and peacekeepers to the various wizards and monks of magic crafters and the variety of beasties and high-tech soldiers and beastmakers, the Gnorcish horde is a wildly diverse bunch of baddies. Only a few stages share enemies, meaning most of the time you'll run into monsters wholly unique to a stage like the Rams in Stone Hill or the shock troops in Twilight Harbor. Connecting itself to this is how the game's animated. I don't want to be throwing around the term Disney or Pixar-esque, but how each and every one of the models moves and reacts is a goldmine. From defenseless Gnorcs running in terror when they spot Spyro to the dragon-eating plants shaking in anticipation for a meal, you could have a video dedicated to showcasing all the various reactions enemies in Spyro have. While I didn't die in these specific ways, Spyro can be flattened like a pancake or swallowed whole depending on what hits him if he is without sparks. Toasty tries to act all menacing and tough, but once he's hit for the first time, the sheep is out of the bag as it starts to act worried and look around. The Gnorc vulture trainers, instead of sicking their trained attack bird on you, opt to swing around their companion like a cudgel, the vulture squawking out in distress. Machine gunners have to recock their guns to continue firing, giving you a brief rest from their onslaught. There is so much detail, and it helps that wrapping around it is the fantastic score and sound direction. Stuart Copeland already proved himself a genius when he played for the Police. He didn't have to go this hard when formulating and engineering a soundtrack, yet he did, and I thank him for it. From the jaunty opening theme welcoming you to the experience to the autocratic marching horns and drums of the Peacekeeper's home, you can't throw a dart without hitting a phenomenal level theme. All of them are catchy to a delightful degree, some of the standouts being all the flight stages, and depending on your age range, Wizard Peak. I see what you did there, Copeland, remixing the track for the Amanda Show theme. A credit I want to give due to Copeland as well as how percussion-heavy Spyro's OST is. Each song has a solid backbeat of some type of drum or instrument within the percussion family, some stages like Alpine Ridge where they are what I would describe to be the lead instrument. This ties back to Copeland's time with the Police as their drummer, a position in a band that oftentimes gets overlooked compared to guitars or vocals. Drums, despite how they are viewed, are key when it comes to laying down rhythms and beats that dictate the rest of the instruments. That means Copeland's knowledge of musical structure and layout is far and away greater than what would have been presumed. There's not enough words on the planet to give Copeland credit for his contributions with the Spyro series and this first title. Much like how the voice acting has a wideish range as well. While spoken dialogue is few and far between in Spyro outside of small talk from the dragons, in the booth is Carlos Lazarkey as the eponymous dragon, with additional voices coming from previous stars of the show: Michael Goh, Dan Smith from Killer 7, and Clancy Brown, Hank from Detroit. While Carlos only played the Spyro role for this entry, replaced by SpongeBob himself, Tom Kenny for the remainder of the original run, I'm not too harsh on his performance as many of the other critics around the time were. I don't visualize the Taco Bell dog with Spyro, even though Carlos also did that voice. Spyro sounds confident but not too cocky so as to be a turnoff, and even he gets taken aback by some of the more ridiculous elements that the other dragons bring up. All in all, Spyro the Dragon still stands the test of time as a second-gen mascot stalwart, cementing itself as one of the better looking and sounding games within the genre.
You've defeated Ganasty Gnorc, collected the dragon eggs, saved all the dragons, and recovered every bit of treasure in the Dragon Kingdom. How do you feel?
I feel fired up, Bob. And I'm happy for the dragon world, of course. I certainly wouldn't want to spend the rest of my dragon days butting heads with Nasty Gnorc and his weird minions.
What's a minion?
Never mind. You know what they say. For every good battle, you need a good adversary. And I felt that Nasty, in spite of his misguided nature, was a worthy opponent. Uh-oh. Here we go again!
Spyro the Dragon is a 3D mascot platformer collectathon where the main goal of the game, besides finishing every stage, is to collect the countless lost treasures of the dragons, free them from their crystal prisons, and find a few eggs or two. On the side of difficulty, Spyro's in the same ballparks as your Marios, Sonics, and other general audience to kid-friendly games. To struggle with Spyro should probably tell you video games aren't going to be your thing. With my ravaged brainstem, I found the title to be easy, though this isn't a criticism labored at Spyro. I don't expect games for kiddlywinks to be taxing on a player's skill level, and the only thing to honestly note is that, like many a title both before and after, Spyro does increase in difficulty as you make your way further along into the adventure. With the most pointless sentences ever written and spoken aloud, I may have lied a little bit when it came to saying that you have to beat all the levels in Spyro to finish it. You must if you want to complete it with the lauded 120%. All that is really important is how much stuff you have collected. For me to explain what that means, let's go to level structure, as Spyro's is separated into hub areas and courses. Each set of levels, or courses as the term is interchangeable in my usage, are connected together via a hub that also acts as its own level. Case in point, when you first start the game, you are dropped into the Artisan homeworld, which has a total of 100 Drims and 4 dragons. However, you are not forced to start with the homeworld. You are free to enter any of the other level portals dotting the hub except in 2 instances. Toasty, who you may only face after you finish another Artisan level, sans the hub, and the Gnorc levels, which you play through sequentially. It's just easier to work your way from level to level completing them than it is to half start one then return to it later. Thankfully, completion rates are tracked from the pause menu, so you can see how many dragons, gems, or eggs you need to find in any given area. These 3 collectibles, by the by, are the most important. You can only move on to the next hub by finding enough of them for the balloonists. Back to the Artisan homeworld, you need 10 dragons to reach the Peacekeeper's homeworld, but how and where you get that magic number is irrelevant. You can pick and choose unless going for full completion. Some balloonists require gems, other eggs, so honestly it is better to pick up everything you can. Dragons are the most visually distinct of the collectibles, as it is a literal dragon encased in crystal. While they make a subtle shaking noise to announce their presence, you'll see them first more often than not. Saving a dragon is as simple as running up to the pedestal they are on. This plays a little cutscene of the saved dragon talking to Spyro about level hints or thanking him for the rescue before they disappear into your inventory. Silently, the game also checkpoints your progress and whatever the world state is at the time. This doesn't count for gems though. Gems are saved to your inventory as soon as you pick them up, and regardless if you die before you reach your dragon or not. That doesn't mean that there isn't any interplay between these two concepts, though. Before going on to that, as I want to finish covering dragons before going to gems, you can step back onto a saved dragon's pedestal to either replay the cutscene or save, which acts as a manual checkpoint. Gems are the major collectible you'll be finding in each stage. They litter about the place begging for you to seize them like Gollum with his precious. Yet there are at least 3 ways Spyro the Dragon places gems in its stages. Freely and in the open, inside containers, and inside monsters. If you remember the opening cutscene, Gnorc did turn all the dragon's treasure into warriors. Before going into the relatively simple combat, gems that are floating in the ether can be yoinked like a Fallout character pickpocketing some random NPC. There might be some challenge to it, but for the most part, gems are free for the taking. The challenge here being simple platforming most of the time. Guess since I've written myself here, let's go over Spyro's abilities. Using PS1 controller layout since I played on emulator, left stick is your movement, X is jump, triangle enters first person mode when held down, and the triggers control the camera. Be advised, camera control can be a bit wonky as the camera doesn't auto-fall unless that option is turned on in options. Neither cameras are all that great, as active is far too active and passive on the opposite side of the scale, and manual camera control is inverted. Right trigger goes left and vice versa. Thankfully, this isn't a game about speed, otherwise this would be a detriment. Because he has wings, Spyro is capable of limited flight in the shape of gliding, falling with style if Toy Story is anything to go off of. This allows Spyro to cover the multitude of gaps he has to pass in order to finish stages or collect gems. See my statement on what the game provides for platforming challenges. However, there are a few caveats to Spyro's gliding. 1. Spyro's glide is dependent on his jump height. You get the best glides out of the top of Spyro's jump, with some wide gaps only traversable by understanding Spyro's jump height. 2, and most importantly, Spyro can't clamber onto ledges. If he doesn't slightly overtake the ledge he's trying to get up on, he'll sink like a stone, usually into an environmental hazard like a bottomless pit or water. One of those is a death sentence, taking a life away. The other damages Spyro for 1 tick of health. That is, unless he doesn't hop out fast enough, in which he drowns, killing him outright. You do have the capability to stop gliding on a dime by hitting triangle, but that is only useful in short glides so that you don't overshoot. Basically, Insomniac would learn from this problem by giving us the hover jump in Spyro 2. There are 4 other buttons I haven't covered as they relate more to combat. Square is charge, circle is flame, and the bumpers are dodge rolls. Spyro only has 2 attacks, but they also factor in gem collecting, as this brings me to the second category of gems, those inside containers. There are a good few types that appear, from ornate chests to metal ones and some specialty boxes. Ornate chests can be flamed or charged into to break, metal boxes must be charged, and all the rest have their own gimmick. Fan chests must be flamed enough to break open, gem catchers force you to collect the gem when it jumps out of the chest, and strong boxes either need super flame, supercharge, an environmental tool, or a key to open. As I haven't mentioned it, gems come in different values ranging from 1 to 5, 10, and 25, but perhaps why I haven't gone into this is I'm assuming most of you will try to finish stages with all the collectibles. Thus brings me to combat. Gnasty's Horde comes in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, which plays an important role in how you take them out. Regardless of what an enemy does, how big they are and if they have armor is how you determine their death. Small fries can be flamed or charged provided they don't have armor, which if they do, you either have to wait until they are vulnerable or must charge them. Big oafs can only be flamed, though some do rock armor, which means they must be defeated either by timing or by some external force. That said, most enemies go down in one hit, and only a few lie outside the spectrum of vulnerability. The animated armors of haunted towers and metal spiders of the high caves need to be defeated either by Super Flame or Charge, which hits through everything. These two elements are mostly an extension of the puzzles, as Super Flame requires timing and Charge jumping. Combat for the completionist is unavoidable. Every enemy carries gems, thus you have to slaughter them all. Remember that interplay I briefly referenced earlier? Yeah, if you die before hitting a checkpoint, all the gems you collected from enemies will still be in your inventory, but they will have all respawned. Save often in case you don't want to burninate the countryside over and over again. Tangentially, this allows me to cover the lesser collectibles in the game, that being the pearls and Spyro miniatures. Both concern lives, as collecting enough of the former from gemless enemies, or one of the latter, sometimes from gemless enemies, most of the time from the shell chests, you gain a life. Dying sends you back to a dragon checkpoint if you touched one, and resets the world back to whatever state it was based on the last dragon you touched. Again, that means enemies can respawn if you aren't thorough. Tangent-wise, I don't know what happens when you game over. My frontal lobe, despite being shaped like overcooked roadkill, prevented me from sucking that hard of the game. Dying is pretty rare from damage accumulation, however. Spyro is able to take 4 hits before pushing up daisies. Yet, taking hits does make collecting gems a bit harder. Instead of directly eating a hit, Spyro is protected by Sparks the dragonfly, who shifts in color to display how hurt our dragon is. Yellow is perfect condition, blue is okay, green is caution, and Sparks disappears after Spyro gets hit while the dragonfly is green. Outside of showcasing Spyro's health, Sparks also grabs errant gems you wander by, meaning you don't have to directly pick them up. Without Sparks, you have to run into a gem's hitbox to get them, which makes grabbing gems a lot slower. To heal Sparks, you have to kill what is described as fodder. Sheeps, lizards, small animals that turn into butterflies for Sparks to eat, making them the last of the non-essential collectibles. Dragon eggs are the last of the toll objects carried by thieves that run when they spot you. Chase them down and give them a good flaming to get their loot. Outside of the traditional stages and hubs, there are 2 other level types found within Spyro: bosses and flights. Bosses are mostly smaller levels that have a tougher enemy inside for you to duel with, though how each approaches Spyro is different. Toasty is a sheep in wolf's clothing, Dr. Shimp has a weak backside, Blowhard, Jacques, and Gnasty are all chases, and Metalhead is a game of whack-a-mole just with pylons. Flights, meanwhile, are obstacle courses where you must destroy, fly through, or activate a set amount of objects within a time limit, gaining a little bit of buffering when you deal with any of said objects. Once you beat Gnasty, Spyro takes you to the credits, though if you've gotten all the rest of the items within the game, back in the Gnorc's realm will be the last dragon and the portal for the loot stage. There isn't any New Game Plus like in the later entries. What makes up a lot of my enjoyment of Spyro the Dragon is the dedication to keeping each level unique in its own regards. Whether that ranges from enemies to layout itself, Spyro has some pretty damn fine levels throughout. Putting its best foot forward, the artisan levels are the perfect starter stages, offering a nice little playground for you to get used to our dragon's moveset. Indeed, the artisan homeworld has no enemies capable of hurting the player. The Gnorc grunts and the thieves will run away from Spyro at the nearest inclination, giving you an ease into how the numerous foes factor into completing the game. They are gem dispensers, so don't be afraid of killing them with the flame breath or charge, and yet sometimes a singular attack might not bring one down. Gnorc thieves take 3 hits to down, teaching you that some enemies are sturdier than others. Adding fervor to this lesson are Stone Hill, Dark Hollow, and Town Square. Each stage has enemies that can hurt Spyro, but all showcase a variety of differing typings. Dark Hollow introduces stationary small armor and big enemies, explaining when you should charge and flame. Stone Hill has chargers, introducing the idea that while an enemy might beeline towards you, their attack has lower priority than Spyro's charge, and the dragon can defeat one provided it is small enough. Town Square has unarmored strikers, informing you that sometimes staying out of attack range with a flame is better than rushing in with a charge. All this comes together with Toasty as it introduces my favorite enemy in the game, the Shepherd's Dogs. The first real challenge Spyro the Dragon tosses your way, but not without foreshadowing. The dogs are made up of bits and parts of the other enemies within the artisan levels, acting as one final test before the game throws tougher challenges your way. Of the beginning area monsters, the dogs will probably catch a first-time player slightly off guard in that their size constitutes them as a large foe, making the charge useless. That's a free pounce for them as you're left reeling in ending lag. It really cements how the Flame Breath is Spyro's primary attack option compared to the charge's utility. Relying on the flames is often a safer option if you can't tell how big an enemy is or if they don't have armor. This will become a key principle going forward for literally all the rest of the enemies from Peacekeepers onward. Most importantly is that the dogs have 2 hit points. A singular singe will slightly annoy the sheephounds into attacking, but this is where they become my favorite creature to face off with. You can do a simple bait and switch after hitting one. Their attack is slow enough to dodge in a multitude of ways. Spyro's base movement allows him to avoid it crushing, and his evasive roll finally gets some mileage. However, the dogs leap up into the air before crashing down. What's to say that you can't meet them up there? Jumping and immediately burning them again is the fastest way to take down the mutts, introducing the idea that Spyro's moves can be employed in clever ways to defeat enemies. Skipping ahead a wee bit, the gigantic beasts in Alpine Ridge are sometimes in holding pens, allowing you to look down on them. Entering first-person mode doesn't prevent Spyro from using his flames. Putting 2 and 2 together, you can take advantage of the height difference to breathe fiery death on mooks from a safe distance. Moving on to Peacekeepers, ranged enemies are added to the mix within Dry Canyon and Ice Cavern. This adds a new dilemma to dealing with an army of Gnasty. Do you attempt to rush down a projectile user before they attack, or patiently wait for them to fire before striking back? Gnorkish forces who prefer sniping are equally stringent to the rules of flaming and charging as the rest of the lineup. Even if, say, a ranged enemy is carrying a shield, like the bazooka troops in Dry Canyon, do you honestly want to test if you can outrun a speeding bullet? Especially since every type of missile-toting threat has both increased spotting and attacking range. Once again, jumping a bit further into the game, the Devil Cupids of Dreamweaver share ranges between spotting and attacking. As soon as they see our little purple friend, they begin unleashing a barrage of arrows regardless of what is in front of them. This will come back when I bring up Beastmakers. Peacekeepers also presents what I will call situational adversaries. This would be the armored Gnorcs in Ice Cavern. Direct damage doesn't phase them as fire bounces off their breastplate while charging slightly pushes them around. But if you charge one off the side of a ledge, they die, introducing a few alternative ways of dealing with pesky or annoying enemies. While Magic Crafters doesn't introduce too much to the dichotomy of Spyro's combat, it does showcase the relations between the typings of monsters you'll face. While all of Gnasty's forces are flying under his flag, that doesn't mean they all get along. The green and armored monks of the mini Magic Crafter stages work in tandem. One will undoubtedly protect the other, whether the green monks lowering armored monks to act as a brick wall between you and them, or the greenies raising their smaller compatriots out of harm's way so you can't get their precious gems. The armored monks share this relationship with the beasts of Alpine Ridge. They either point one in your direction or ride one into battle. However, not all monks come from the same school of thought. The green and armored monks hate the elemental monks with a passion. The feeling is mutual within and without, the white ice monks disliking the wind monks, as both sides are typically trying to one-up the other, which is not cash money under the Shadow Wizard money game guidelines. And yet this is a veritable boon for you. The ice Gnorcs summoned by the white ice monks are fully capable of defeating armored monks, giving you free gems, and monks engaged in spell-to-spell combat are distracted. Because their focus is on something else, you can easily sneak up and take a monk out, imparting that wisdom that you can take advantage of enemies to deal with others. Back to that point I brought up in Beastmakers, the electrofloor Gnorc dudes use the very environment against you by zapping the metal flooring they stand on. While the rest of the Gnorcish Beastmaker threats are unaffected by the move, you can blame their rubber soles as Don West would. One of the first things that gets highlighted in this set of worlds is a chicken being fried by one of the electrofloor Gnorcs. While the Ice Gnorcs are programmed to beat up the armored monks as they are in close proximity, you have to chase a chicken onto the floor to watch it fry. Adding fervor to this, when fighting Metalhead, he is just as able to destroy the pylons powering him as you are. Sometimes baiting him into stupidity is far safer, as the pylons can protect themselves with a damaging barrier that you can't hit through, but he can. Because he is constantly attacking with either his beams or by throwing the monkey men at you, a smart player would let him do most of the work as you single out the harder to reach energy towers. Beastmakers and Dreamweavers share the same ethos in teaching the player, as both level sets take the kid gloves off in comparison to the previous areas, which makes sense as both are before Ganasty's realm. Dreamweavers has one last lesson to teach you, bridging it and the previous level set of Beastmakers together. The Devil Cupids, as previously mentioned, often attack as soon as they spot you. While this can be annoying when trying to get to them as you have to dodge a barrage, remember what I said about the monks, electrofloor dudes, and Metalhead? Those arrows count as an attack towards anyone. Dark Passage, for as much fear as I have for that level, brilliantly displays how you can use foes to beat others, the Cupids bullseyeing any devil dog that may be in the way of their arrows. Why put yourself in danger when you can get a kill for free? While I do think that Beastmakers and Dreamweavers are the weakest level sets in terms of length, they still introduce new facets of the gameplay to the player. Gnorc Cove and Twilight Harbor are the penultimate levels for Spyro in more ways than one. While you are finally taking the fight to Ganasty, both levels take advantage of all the ideas the previous stages have introduced and put them into two finales. Realizing I haven't brought up the bosses and I'm already at the end of the rope, all of them are solid in both looks and gameplay terms. Toasty is a weak starter boss that poses little threat, Dr. Shimp is an overtly cocky armored moron that loves to show his ass, Blowhard mixes level and boss together quite seamlessly, I've already covered Metalhead, Jacques a gliding challenge, and Ganasty as climactic as he's been built up to be. Perhaps my favorite detail in the Ganasty fight is that he spends most of the time running away from Spyro. He's supposed to be this big bad slayer of all the dragons, yet he cowers in front of a tiny little pipsqueak. He never swings around his big club, he always tries to shoot at Spyro instead of putting his supposed strength to any use. A paper tiger, you could say, just as the introduction describes him as. This is going to be half personal grievance, half what this tab is usually dedicated to, because I have a bone to pick with Spyro the Dragon, as it unequivocally fucked me up as a child. 4 fiends put fear into your fair host. The vultures, the metal spider beetles, the dragon-eating plants, and the demon dogs. Let me provide some deep insight into what makes me tick. Doesn't faze me. Some googly-eyed, slightly goofy cartoon creature that is what a child thinks up as scary terrifies the shit out of me. I don't know why. Perhaps it's because all 4 have the same tactic of rushing Spyro as soon as he's within range, but the bulls and the rams do that too, and I ain't afraid of them. On the visual front, it's not like there's some hyper-realistic anomaly within the enemy roster. Besides the plants, who are absolutely the scariest designed foe, which is probably the concept for them, the rest are fitting with the Gnorc army visually. It's hard to articulate this point, as this is inherently primordial. Some hidden away piece of my reptile brain lights up all its synapses with abject terror, causing me to be deathly cautious around all 4. You can see that in Dark Passage, where even when the dogs are in small baby form, I still treat them like the devils they are. The plants I'm even worse with, slowly edging towards their attack range in what must be the visual equivalent to the heat death of the universe. Again, Compare this towards any other game I've played for the channel that was squarely in the horror genre. I could bat away the monsters of Silent Hill all day, every day without breaking into a cold sweat. The same can't be said for these ostensibly innocent creatures. I can't be the only person to suffer like this, and going forward within the Spyro series would add more new nightmares to constantly torment me. The bee trees and bushes of Fracture Hills, the robot sharks of Aquaria Towers, the piranhas of Spooky Swamp, and the spiders of Hero's Tale. I don't like them, but mostly in a weird, angsty way. Fighting the four isn't too taxing, unlike the attack frogs, who I think are the worst enemy in the game. Spyro isn't exactly a combat-focused title. Enemies act more like living hazards than outright threats. This is pretty common in the second era of the mascot platformer. Third gen was when Ratchet, Sly, and Jack started leaning towards heavier usage of direct conflict, Ratchet essentially becoming a hybrid third-person shooter. As such, in Spyro, you only have two options of attack. Flame and Charge. They get the job done for most except for the frogs, and not because they're ill-equipped to handle the amphibians. It's actually the reverse. The frogs are seemingly designed with a different approach entirely compared to the rest of the rogues gallery. Most enemies either wait for you to wallop them or charge ahead to get walloped. Every other foe can be beaten before they launch an attack. Even if a flame or charge fails to connect, Spyro's mobility allows him a grace period when a creature does strike. All except frogs. Call this a grave period as they'll put you 6 feet under before you can blink. Patient like death stalking its prey, the frogs will wait for you to bumble towards them as soon as you're in their spotting range. A spotting range that is somewhat sizable, equal to the bushes that also inhabit the swamp. The differing factor here is the attack range. Around half the frog's spotting perimeter is where they're able to lunge out with their tongues. They are the only stationary enemy to have priority, seen as charging or shooting foes most of the time will have an equal spotting and attacking range. The amphibian's attack will always come out first when Spyro tries to flame or charge them, effectively making the second of Spyro's combat abilities moot as you'll be hit before you can reach the toadies. Since the dodge roll is slightly cumbersome, baiting an attack is equally ill-advised. We're not in Soulsborne and the move doesn't give iframes. The safest method of extinction to the blue menaces is catching them in animation frames. Cheesy like a royale, some enemies lack the ability to act when they play an idle or aggression animation. The shepherds can be struck freely when they twirl their canes, for instance. Whenever one of the frogs croaks, pun intended, they are completely defenseless. While this approach can be completely depended on, it doesn't feel like I'm taking advantage of what the game gives me in terms of Spyro's abilities. I'm using technical limitations to supplant an annoying obstacle. It begs the question why Misty Bog is so filled with them like Moses ring up the burning bush. This sole factor makes it the worst level in Spyro's first outing, and that's barely going into the clumps of Clamatans. You don't fight frogs in feeble flocks. They always come 3 a pop and sometimes even more. That means Misty Bog is surprisingly combat focused, despite the shortcomings of the actual fighting done within Spyro. This isn't a complaint leveraged against flaming and charging. As stated earlier, they pick up the slack, mostly because enemies are so docile or easy to read. You either push the pace or let a monster run towards death. The frogs lie outside that range, the cramped places you face them in not helping matters. The kill room, as I call it, is stacked with 5 frogs and 4 Gnorc dudes, 9 in totality, and stationed in a way that expresses the flaws of Spyro's simple moveset when placed under the duress of action. Skyla and Charybdis, to keep with the Greek analogies. Spyro's idea of fighting lots of enemies is placing small guys in a line so you can charge them. Whenever the game shifts away from that, the flaws crop up as showcased in the kill room, as you have to awkwardly wrangle yourself around to avoid damage. While this interweaving problem is my major complaint with Spyro the Dragon, I don't care too much for the back half of the title, specifically Beastmakers and Dreamweavers. Long in the tooth is the turn of phrase, as levels like the aforementioned Misty Bog, Terrace Village, Haunted Towers, Lofty Castle, Dark Passage, and Treetops go on for a period that overstays its welcome. Between the actual size of the stages and having to hunt for gems, you can get flipped turned upside down to the point of annoyance. There's no easy way to search for missing gems except for the visual twinkle, but that requires line of sight, and if you can't spot the effect, be prepared to scour around a stage looking for that last bit of change. For such an early stage, Stonehill is the problem in microcosm. But it gets worse, as at least Stonehill had no gimmicks. Whenever Spyro 1 wants to add spice to a level, it follows one of two paths, sometimes even joining the two: Super Flame and Supercharge. The former is bland if inoffensive, usually taking the shape of a timing puzzle. Supercharging, meanwhile, can be aggravating, as it sometimes is unintuitive. The links that Treetops wants you to take to reach its thieves relies on trial and error a bit too much. And that's merely scouting the pathways you must take. Botching a charge jump is relatively easy and sends you back to a checkpoint one life down on the best of occasions. Worst case scenario, you have to retrace your steps back to the starting ramp. The fundamental concept for Treetops is solid. The execution is poor, marred by the size of the canopy in conjunction with how messy Supercharge happens to be. Thankfully, this section of the game, Beastmakers and Dreamweavers, is slightly saved by Metalhead and Jacques, two of the better bosses in the game, and the entirety of Gnasty Gnorc's realm following after. Spyro the Dragon is still one of my favorite mascot platformers. It has a tight blend of Collectathon elements mixed with truly solid art direction and music. There's never a moment of backtracking or frustration when it comes to seeking out what Spyro needs you to collect to get further into the game, and outside of a few subset of monsters, I really love the enemy design. For a second title after a failure, Insomniac really brought their A-game, starting a legacy for themselves that they still kinda live up to today. Of the three original titles, Spyro the Dragon is my favorite one, and though there is the reignited version, I will always find the original PlayStation 1 copy to be one of the coziest games of my childhood. That's not to say that there is no reason to play Reignited. It is a proper remaster with a few extra bits and bobs. Hell, I own it and think that it is a wonderful time with only some slight issues pertaining to some of the design choices, the motion blur, and the fact that Activision has its greasy mitts all over it. It's a bit like how some classic Shadow Warrior maps have Randy Pitchford stench all over them. There is definite care put into Reignited, which is all the more applaudable seeing as Toys wasn't given the original source code. Take lessons, Silent Hill HD Collection, otherwise I'll have to bring up Silent Hill Ranch written in Comic Sans. Ugh. Anywho, this show is made possible with the likes of the moviegoers within the Peanut Gallery and Inner Circle. Consider buying a ticket at patreon.com/Let's Talk About Games, no apostrophe in the Let's, for behind the scenes access to LTA scripts, thumbnails, other bonus material, your name in the credits, and early screenings of episodes, plus the Showtime reels. Call this a summertime blockbuster as I'm covering a zombie game in June, one of the worst games I've ever played in the shape of Operation Raccoon City is next on the reels docket, and boy will you be shocked at what was left on the cutting room floor. And as always, this showing of Spyro the Dragon is over, but stay tuned for our next feature involving another animal mascot, some dimensional fuckery, and developers who weren't the originals.